Her son has been missing for 2 months, but the mother received a call from her son, but she was very calm when she got a call from her son. What's even stranger is that after her son's disappearance, the house was never locked. The door was locked. It was as if she knew her son would never come back. The mother's strange behavior was seen by a professor, but he didn't want to call the police right away, because in this village, 5 boys disappeared at the same time. The police dispatched 300,000 officers. They issued 200 million flyers, but they couldn't find any trace of them, and the whole society was shocked by the incident. And the day of the murder, it was the day of the election of the district governor. As a result, the disappearance of the case, a large number of people were distracted by the election. The results of the election were unfair, and the professor is one of the candidates for governor. If he can find strong evidence of the disappearance case, he'll be able to win the people's approval. He'll be reappointed as the mayor of the district. In order to solidify the clues, he first sought connections. He got his mother's phone recordings. Then he asked the neighbors to identify her. The voice of the child on the phone is the mother's son. Sure enough, when the neighbors heard it, he was sure it was the mother's son. With this clue, the professor immediately went to the police, but the police didn't believe him. How could a mother kill her own son? And a recording alone cannot be used as evidence. The case had to be left unsettled. Luckily, the professor recorded some speculations on video. One day later, a reporter with a bad career found it. He was in desperate need of a big story. He thought he'd take his chances, so he asked the professor to meet him. The professor said the reason why I suspected the mother, because the police have installed recording and tracing functions on every missing family member's phone. The police have installed a recording and tracking function on every missing family member's phone. Obviously his son has already identified him on the phone. Why didn't he push the tracking button? So many police officers are searching the area. If he's really in the mountains, how can he not be found? The more the reporter heard, the more he got excited. So they went to the missing person's house. He went to the missing person's house. He decided to help the professor to uncover the truth. But they didn't expect anything. Everyone in the house was out of sorts. The mother had been washing dishes in the kitchen. Not only no basic greetings, she didn't even look back. And the father seemed to sense the mother's deliberate avoidance. He was very enthusiastic about showing them a picture of his children, but after searching for a long time, she didn't even know where the album was. The grandmother was even more curious. He took advantage of the father's back to get the album, suddenly cut off 2 fingers. Then he pointed at the father, as if to say that there was something wrong with the father. As soon as he saw grandma's behavior, he immediately kicked him out of the room. The 2 of them felt that something was really wrong. They decided to leave the room to discuss what to do. Before leaving, the professor suddenly wanted to go to the toilet, but his father got nervous. He wanted to go with him, and while the professor was going to the toilet, father kept talking in the toilet, as if to attract the professor's attention. The professor was on a small toilet, father was on the big one, but when the professor came out, father came out too. This kid in a cape kept running, because he was teased that if the cape fell to the ground, then he would disappear forever, and the innocent boy believed it. So he took his friends and ran up the hill, and never came back. But the strange thing was, these children often went to the mountains to play. They usually left in the morning and came back before dinner. But on the afternoon of the day they disappeared, one of the children's mother went straight to the police station to report the disappearance. That's a bit early, isn't it? And that's not all. A professor who was investigating the case, he found a lot of doubts. He believes the children must have been buried somewhere in the house. He got his reporter friend to bring in the press, in front of everyone, to turn the relatives' home upside down. The professor sent someone to drain the cesspool first, because in the last interview, the father of the missing child had always avoided this place. Then he sent someone else to smash the newly paved floor in the backyard, because he didn't believe the father of a missing child would have the heart to renovate his own backyard. A little while later, the workers found a child's shoe. They found a child's shoe. Everyone got nervous. They cleaned it up and realized it was a girl's shoe. It was a girl's shoe, and the missing children were all boys. The worst news is that the backyard was dug up, but nothing was found. The professor understands. He called all the media and police. If he can't find any evidence, it's not as simple as apologizing. At that critical moment, the professor saw the child's grandmother. He hurriedly pulled him over. He asked him to do the same thing he did during the interview. When they came here last time, it was the grandmother's gesture. The professor was convinced. The parents were suspected of murder. Under the urging of the crowd, Grandma finally made that gesture again, a gesture that resembles murder. But in the next moment, Grandma pointed her hand, pointed at the professor, and then pointed at everyone in the room. A neighbor couldn't stand it. He said Grandma had Alzheimer's. Before the child disappeared, she used to do this all the time, but the professor didn't believe him. The crowd was in an uproar. Not only does the professor have no evidence, he just guessed. He put the blame for the child's disappearance. He put the blame on the biological parents for the child's disappearance. This kind of secondary injury is undoubtedly the greatest insult to the parents. People are blocking the way. The situation was out of control. The professor fled in disgrace. From then on, his life was at a low ebb, and the reporter who helped him to investigate the case knew he was wrong. Looking at the father of the missing child, his heart was filled with guilt. 10 years have passed. The case took a new turn. A father and son were traveling. They found some white bones in the mountains. No matter the size or clothes, they were sure they were the missing children. Ironically, the bones of the children are located 2 kilometers from the village. When the police mobilized 300,000 manpower to search for them, but they didn't even find the children's clothes. After forensic examination, each skull, there are dozens of tiny scars. This suggests that the child was first abused with a sharp instrument before being killed with a single blow. It's brutal. When they heard the news, the reporter was the first to arrive. By this time, he was already a father. He realized how much his recklessness, he knew how much psychological damage he had done to the families of the disappeared. This time he wanted to find the murderer himself, to give the families an explanation. According to the forensic description, judging from the shape of the bones, they were all blindfolded. Their hands and feet were tied together. They were buried in the ground like a stacked hammock. The way they were tied was also very special. The more the sailor's knot struggled, the tighter they were tied, but it can be opened with a slight pull from the outside. The reporter instantly thought of someone. It's the old detective who's been in charge of this case. The old policeman loves fishing. That's why he often used the sailor's knot to pack things. Maybe he knows something. The man was lying in a tree pit, covering his head with his clothes, but he's afraid it's not tight enough. He had to tie it in a knot, because only in this way, he could really feel the fear of the dead. 5 children died here. Each one of them was abused in the same way, by the murderer's force, and then brutally killed. An old detective said he actually suspected someone. He was from out of town. He liked to fish in his spare time. He knew the mountain terrain like the back of his hand. And most importantly, this guy often uses the sailor's knot. It's exactly the same as the method of kidnapping children. After hearing this, Wei immediately set off. Soon found the address of the other side. Seeing no one in the house, Wei quietly slipped in, but the investigation revealed a lot of things. A big man. The house was full of children's toys. There were also hairbrushes for girls, and the bags on the side. They're all wrapped in sailor knots. It's exactly the same as the way the children were tied up. Wei was sure that this was the murderer, so he hid in the car and watched quietly. After a long time, the murderer came back. After all these years, he was still very cautious. When he saw signs that the house had been tampered with, he knew he'd been compromised. So he went downstairs. He found Wei sleeping, and saw his own portrait in the car. He thought it was a peaceful night, but just as Wei was returning home, his wife suddenly called. She said her daughter was missing. Wei was baffled. He followed the route home, started desperately searching. Finally, at a roadside, he found his daughter. My daughter said I fell down accidentally. A kind uncle brought me home. He also bandaged my wound. Seeing the way the wound was robbed, Wei instantly understood. This is a warning from the murderer. Wei didn't want to investigate secretly. He drove straight to the slaughterhouse where the other party works. But when he saw Wei's arrival, the man was not surprised at all. He just stared at the cows in front of him. Then with a long nail in his hand, hammer after hammer madly smashed down. Wei finally understood where the holes in his head came from. He also understands what the police said. When there's no conflict of interest between the deceased and the murderer, there's no emotional entanglement, then the most likely, the murderer is a demon who is addicted to killing. Thinking of the innocent children, Wei could no longer control his emotions. He came up to fight with the other guy. He has no training. He was thrown out in a couple of moves. Then he strangled Wei's neck. But just as he was about to die, He suddenly let go of his hand. Y roared in despair but couldn't do anything. A few days later, the bodies of the 5 children were pieced together. The wronged mother finally found her children, and she told Wei the truth. After her son's disappearance, every day he would receive some messy phone calls, and the phone call discovered by the professor back then. He knew right away that it was a prank by a bare child, so he delayed pressing the tracking button, those pretending to be suspicious behavior, all to keep the police from giving up the search. This film is based on a real case, the case of the missing frog boys. The remains of the children were found 11 years after the disappearance of the 5 children. The remains of the children were found, but the murderer has not been caught yet. It's one of the 3 most unsolved cases in Korea. The impact of this case was so bad that in 2007, Korea lifted the retroactive period, only 15 years. From then on, as long as the murderer is not caught, the murderer will be pursued until the case is closed, so that those criminals who take chances will live in fear forever.